in someone something that is not really there, that has to be given to him from an alien source. But this word logizomai in the Greek is used exactly the opposite way in the New Testament. It refers to actually seeing something in the person, recognizing something intrinsic in the person itself. Look that up in your concordance and you'll see that the Protestant interpretation of this word is totally wrong. Dr. White never gave us one good reason why Romans 4 cannot refer to David himself as well as everyone else. He tried desperately to separate everyone else who receives this righteousness from David. And the reason why is because he has to. He cannot have David be the recipient of this justification, because that would show that justification is not a one-time forensic event. It is a process. We can back this up also in Romans 1:17, where Paul says, "The just shall live by faith." And he's referring to the little book of Habakkuk. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, Habakkuk uses the same phrase. And the book of Habakkuk is only 3 chapters long. And if you read that book, you will not find one hint of forensic legal imputation of righteousness at all. What you will find is a man who has to believe in God, despite the fact that God is not judging Israel as soon as he would like him to judge it. And that's the Catholic concept of faith. He has to remain strong in his faith, despite all the circumstances around him that say God is not who he says he is. That is the Catholic concept. There is no legal imputation in Habakkuk. Dr. White talked about he who endures to the end will be saved, and said that we can't interpret it the way that it stands. The Greek will not allow that to happen. We have to interpret it as a conditional. That's the way the Greek gives it to us. If you endure to the end, you will be saved. He talked about saving faith. Let me pose this to you. If you're justified by faith alone, most Protestants agree that it has to be good faith, or what they would call saving faith. Faith that produces good works. If so, then someone must judge the quality of your faith to see if it qualifies as saving faith. That judge is God. But if God were to judge your faith by his perfect standards, your faith would not be acceptable to him. Look at Abraham's lapses of faith in Genesis 16 and Genesis 17. Obviously, his faith wasn't perfect, was it? But God accepted it. He accepted Abraham's faith for justification through his grace, not through looking at Abraham's faith through his perfect standards of law, because no one's faith could measure up to God's expectations if it was judged by the perfect standards of God. No, God has to look at his faith through grace. But this is precisely how Catholics say that God looks at our works, through his grace. In fact, the Catholic theology teaches that God looks at both our faith and our works through his grace, and that's why he can accept them. If he judged either our faith or our works by the law, by his perfect standards, no one could measure up to God. There is a fallacy in Protestant thinking that James, when he speaks about works, is talking merely about the fruit of faith. That is not true. The impression that's given is that works automatically flow once you have the faith. And you will find James never teaching that in his book. The impression is given that as soon as you press the button of faith, that the works automatically run down the conveyor belt. And that is not what James teaches at all. As a matter of fact, the whole book of James is an admonition to stop sinning and to do good works. That's what he talks about. The works are not automatic. They don't inevitably flow from your faith. It takes hard effort. As a matter of fact, in James 2, verse 1, he says, you are all believers. You all have faith. But what's your problem? You're showing favoritism to the man who's rich and denying the man who's poor. Now, are those works automatically flowing from them? Automatically? Do they love the poor man? No. That's the problem. And that's why he says in verse 14, the issue is, if you have this faith but you don't love this poor man, can you be saved? That is the issue at stake. And as far as the standard of perfection is concerned, in James chapter 2, verse 13, James says, seek to be judged by the law that shows mercy. The law of liberty. That's exactly what the Catholic theology teaches. James says, seek to be judged by God's liberty and freedom, His grace. Because if He has to judge you by law, you will never be able to reach His perfect standards of righteousness, and you will be condemned. And who are those that end up under the judgment of law? It's the sinners. Those who commit murder and adultery in verses 10, 11, and 12 of James chapter 2. They will be judged by the law, and they will never measure up to God's righteousness. Therefore, he says, seek to be judged by mercy in verse 2:13. John 5:24 was mentioned. It says we passed out of judgment, but that is the judgment of eternal damnation, because in the next verses, in John 5:28 and 29, which I mentioned 3 times tonight, it says that those who have done good will receive the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil will receive the resurrection of damnation. So 4 verses later, after the verse Dr. White quoted, it says we will be judged by our works. Now he mentioned also without works, that we're saved, justified without works. And I have already agreed with that tonight. But I made a grand distinction, and that distinction is that Paul is talking about works of debt. If someone says, God, you owe me for what I have done, despite the fact that I don't like you or want to serve you, or have hope in you, you owe me as if I am your employee, Paul says that's anathema. God will never accept that. God wants faith. Why? Because faith is a personal relationship. It believes in God for who God is. And that's what God wants, because He's a personal being. God does not want work stuck in His face, because that means you don't care about God. All you care about is your paycheck. Now, Elizabeth and Zechariah, as I already mentioned in Luke chapter 1, verse 6, were called blameless and righteous by God Himself for obeying the commandments. And Noah, the same, was blameless in his day. And Job, it says, he was the righteous man in the east. And David and Abraham, and you can go through all the list. And David says that by my works, God acquits me in Psalm 18. We saw that as well. So all through the Bible, we see men doing works that God enjoys. How can God enjoy them? Not by His perfect standards, but by His eyes of grace. In Zechariah chapter 1, verse 3, dealing with this idea of theocentric or anthropocentric, God Himself says, Israel, turn to me, and I will turn to you. The very verse used by St. Augustine to show that, yes, there is a free will man has, and God gives us the grace to have that free will. Now, who has the sovereign God?